As a review for the Edgenuity lesson, solving quadratic functions, square root property. So I've said before in previous videos that when you have an x squared and a plain x, the only way to solve it is to factor. So on these ones, we don't have an x squared and an x. It's either just an x squared or just an x. And when that happens, just solve it like normal. So for here, x squared minus 16 equals 0. I would add 16 to both sides. And then to undo squared, we square root. Whenever you square root both sides of an equation, you have to put a plus or minus in front of your solution. So the square root of 16 is 4. So x could be positive 4 or negative 4. This one, again, just solve like normal. It's just an x squared. There's no plain x. So I'm going to add 9. Divide by 16. And the very last thing, to undo the squared, we're going to square root both sides. When you square root both sides of an equation, you have to put a plus or minus in the front. And when you have the square root of a fraction like this, you can just do the square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. So this is the same thing as the square root of 9 over the square root of 16. So the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So positive or negative 3/4. This last one says, solve 5x plus 6 squared minus 3 equals 21. So whenever you have something being added or subtracted onto the side, you need to get rid of that first. So I'm going to add 3. So where a lot of misconceptions come in here is students think that you need to, one, distribute the squared. You can't do that. If there's ever a plus or a minus in here, you would have to write it out as 2 factors and FOIL it. But we don't want to do that either because that's going to make it a lot harder. What we can do if we have 5x plus 6, that quantity squared equals 24, go ahead and just square root both sides and get rid of it. So the square root cancels out the squared, and I get 5x plus 6 equals plus or minus, because I square rooted both sides of the equation, root 24. Now over here on the side, I'm going to show you how to simplify roots. So if you ever have the square root of a number that's divisible by another perfect square, so numbers that you need to look for: 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared, 8 squared, 9 squared, 10 squared. And you need to ask yourself, my value here 24, or do any of these numbers go into 24, or is 24 divisible by any of these? And it's divisible by 4. So instead of writing the square root of 24, I'm going to rewrite it as 4 times 6. 4 times 6 is 24. And so then what we do now is, the reason I chose 4, a number from this list of what's called perfect squares, is because now I can split it up and say that this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. We can do the square root of 4 and get a whole number solution. The square root of 4 is 2. So we're just left with 2 root 6. So it has to be multiplication, and it has to be a number from this list of perfect squares. I've only done the first 10. There are more. Because you want to be able that when you take the square root of that value, you get an integer out front like that. So I'm going to rewrite this now as plus or minus 2 root 6. So then we just solve like normal. We subtract 6. These are not like terms. It's like having negative 6 and then a 2x there. So you leave them apart. It's negative 6 plus or minus 2 root 6. And the very last thing we do is we're going to divide both sides by 5. And if you want, you can just leave it as a big, sometimes I was looking through the quiz, sometimes they leave it like this, so just one big fraction. Sometimes they distribute the divide by 5 to both parts and say it's negative 6/5 plus or minus 2 root 6 over 5. So either solution here is correct.